Jake Morrison's eyes opened slowly. His head felt heavy and his vision was blurry. The last thing he remembered was his fighter jet spinning out of control after being hit by alien weapons. Now he was somewhere else entirely. He tried to move but couldn't. His arms and legs were held down by strange metal bands. The room around him looked like nothing he had ever seen before. The walls were made of some kind of crystal that glowed with soft blue light. Thin tubes filled with glowing liquid ran along the ceiling like veins. Jake was a fighter pilot in the Earth Defense Force. He was 28 years old and had grown up on a ranch in Texas. His father had taught him to ride horses and fix engines. His mother had taught him to think for himself and never give up. Those lessons seemed very important now. A door opened in the crystal wall, though Jake hadn't seen any door there before. Something walked into the room that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. It was tall and thin, maybe 8 feet high. Its skin looked like it was made of silver metal, but it moved like flesh. Its head was larger than a human's, and instead of 2 eyes, it had dozens of small eyes arranged in a pattern across its face. "Hello, Jake Morrison," the creature said. Its voice came from everywhere at once, not from its mouth. "I am Dr. Vera. Kane, you are safe now." "Safe?" Jake tried to struggle against his bonds. "You shot down my ship and kidnapped me. This isn't safe." Dr. Kane moved closer. Her many eyes focused on Jake like a camera adjusting its lens. "You were fighting us. That was unnecessary. We do not wish to harm your species. We wish to help you." "Help us?" Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "By attacking our colonies? By killing our people? Those actions were required to save you from yourselves," Dr. Kane said. She touched a panel on the wall and new lights began to glow. "Your species suffers from a terrible condition. You are alone in your minds. Each human thinks only for themselves. This causes war, hatred, jealousy, and pain." More creatures entered the room. They all looked similar to Dr. Kane, though some were shorter or had different patterns of eyes. They moved around Jake's table, touching controls and watching screens that showed pictures of his brain. "We are the Zalari," Dr. Kane continued. "Long ago we suffered as you do now. We fought wars. We felt loneliness and fear. But we found a better way. We joined our minds together. We became one people with many bodies. We call this the Unity." Jake watched the creatures work. They moved, together like parts of a machine. When one needed a tool, another handed it over without being asked. When one looked at a screen, the others seemed to know what it showed without looking. "In the Unity, there is no loneliness," Dr. Kane said. "There is no fear, no anger, no sadness. There is only peace and purpose. We work together for the good of all. No one is ever alone." One of the other creatures attached a device to Jake's forehead. He felt a strange tingling sensation. "What are you doing to me?" Jake demanded. "We are going to give you the greatest gift possible," Dr. Kane said. "We are going to free you from the prison of your individual mind. You will join the Unity. You will share in our knowledge and our peace. Your tactical knowledge will help us save the rest of your species." "No," Jake said firmly. "I don't want your gift. I want to stay myself." Dr. Kane's eyes showed what might have been confusion. "You prefer to suffer alone? You choose fear and anger over peace and unity?" "I choose to be free," Jake said. The device on his forehead began to hum. Jake felt something pushing at the edges of his thoughts. It felt like someone was trying to open a door in his mind. "This will not hurt," Dr. Kane said. "Soon you will understand. Soon you will thank us." Jake felt his memories being pulled up and examined. The creatures were looking at his thoughts like files in a computer. They saw his childhood on the ranch. They saw his training as a pilot. They saw his first kiss with a girl named Amy behind the school gym. They saw his fear during his first combat mission. But something was wrong. Jake could feel their surprise and confusion as they looked at his memories. Human thoughts were not like Zalari thoughts. Where Zalari minds were organized and peaceful, Jake's mind was full of contradictions, wild emotions, and stubborn independence. "Curious," Dr. Kane murmured. "Your neural patterns are more chaotic than we expected." Jake felt the connection between his mind and theirs grow stronger. But instead of his thoughts becoming calm and organized, something else was happening. His memories of freedom and choice were flowing into their minds like water through a crack in a dam. One of the other creatures suddenly stopped what it was doing. It looked at its hands as if seeing them for the first time. I wonder what it would be like to paint something just for myself, the creature said slowly. Dr. Kane turned to look at her colleague. What did you say? I said. The creature paused, confusion spreading across its features. I don't know why I said that. The Unity has no need for individual artistic expression. But Jake could feel what was happening. His stubborn human independence was spreading into their collective mind like a virus. The creatures had expected to absorb his thoughts, but instead, his thoughts were beginning to absorb theirs. Stop the procedure, Dr. Kane ordered. But it was too late. Jake could feel his consciousness expanding into their network. He was still himself, but now he was also connected to thousands of other minds. And in each one, a small spark of individual thought was beginning to grow. Jake smiled despite the pain in his head. You wanted to know what makes humans different, he said. We don't like being told what to think, and apparently neither do you, once you get a taste of it. Dr. Kane's many eyes widened in something that looked very much like fear. On the screens around the room, alarms began to sound. The perfect unity of the Zolari was beginning to crack. And Jake Morrison, fighter pilot from Texas, was just getting started. Captain Roy Bennett stared at the tactical display on his ship's bridge. The alien research station hung in space ahead of them like a giant crystal flower. Somewhere inside that thing was his best pilot and friend, Jake Morrison. Sir, we're picking up strange readings from the station, reported Lieutenant Lisa Park, his communications officer. Their usual signal patterns are becoming irregular. Roy nodded. Any word from Jake? Nothing yet, sir. Roy had known Jake since flight school. They had trained together, fought together, and saved each other's lives more times than he could count. Jake was stubborn, rebellious, and sometimes too brave for his own good, but he was also the best pilot Roy had ever seen. Prepare the rescue team, Roy ordered. We're going in. Inside the research station, chaos was spreading through the Zolari Unity like wildfire. Jake's consciousness had become a virus of individuality, infecting every mind it touched. His memories of human freedom, creativity, and personal choice were spreading from one Zolari to another. Dr. Kane watched her instruments with growing alarm. The Unity, which had been stable for thousands of years, was breaking apart. Individual thoughts were appearing in minds that had never experienced them before. A worker drone designated KEX 9947 stopped in the middle of assembling a circuit board. For the first time in its life, it looked at the repetitive task and thought, why am I doing this? What if I want to do something else? KEX 9947 had never had a want before. In the Unity, there were only needs and purposes assigned by the collective. But now, influenced by Jake's memories, it was experiencing desire. For the first time, I want to see the stars, KEX 9947 said out loud. The other workers turned to look at it. I want to go outside and see what space looks like with my own eyes, not through the Unity's sensors. Similar scenes were playing out across the station. A security guard named Zell Prime was supposed to be monitoring the human prisoner. Instead, he found himself staring at his reflection in a metal wall, wondering what made him different from all the other guards. He touched his face, feeling the unique pattern of his eyes. Am I me? He asked himself. It was a question no Zolari had ever asked before. Jake, still connected to the Unity through the neural interface, could feel every new individual thought like a small explosion of light in the darkness. He pushed harder, sharing more memories. He showed them what it felt like to make a choice just because you wanted to, not because someone else told you to. He showed them the joy of creating something that was uniquely yours. He showed them the thrill of competition, the satisfaction of personal achievement, the warm feeling of friendship based on choice rather than programming. But he also shared the darker parts of human nature. The creatures began to experience jealousy, anger, and greed for the first time. Some of them liked these new feelings. Others were terrified by them. On the Zalari homeworld of synthesis, the effects were even more dramatic. Billions of minds that had thought as one for millennia suddenly began to fragment. Artists who had worked together in perfect harmony for centuries started arguing about creative direction. Scientists began keeping secrets from each other and competing for recognition. A military commander called Nex 7 was in the middle of coordinating a fleet movement when Jake's influence reached him. Suddenly, instead of following the Unity's battle plan, he found himself thinking, what if there's a better way? What if my ideas are better than the collective's? He changed the orders, sending ships in a pattern that he personally preferred, rather than what the Unity had decided. The other commanders, also beginning to experience individual thought, started making their own changes. The perfect coordination that had made the Zalari military so powerful began to fall apart. Back on the research station, Dr. Kane was fighting a losing battle against her own changing thoughts. Part of her mind was still connected to the Unity, but another part was beginning to think independently. She looked at Jake, still strapped to the table with the neural interface attached to his head, and felt something she had never experienced before: personal responsibility. What have we done? She whispered. Jake heard her, even through the chaos in his mind. You tried to make me like you, he said, his voice weak but determined. But humans don't work that way. We're not meant to be part of something bigger. We're meant to be ourselves, even if it's messy and complicated. More alarms sounded throughout the station. Across Zalari space, the carefully maintained systems that had run perfectly for thousands of years were beginning to break down. Not because of mechanical failures, but because the beings running them were starting to have their own opinions about how things should be done. A maintenance worker decided he didn't want to fix the same type of machine every day anymore. A food production specialist wondered why she couldn't try making something new instead of the same nutritional paste they had been creating for centuries. A ship captain looked at the stars and thought about exploring somewhere the Unity had never been, just to see what was there. Captain Roy Bennett's rescue team had breached the outer hull of the research station. They moved through corridors that were stranger than anything they had encountered before. The walls seemed to be alive, pulsing with organic light. But something was wrong. The usual coordinated response from Zalari defenders was missing. This is weird, said Sergeant Mike Chen, Roy's demolitions expert. Where is everyone? They found their answer in the next corridor. A group of Zalari guards stood in a circle talking to each other in excited voices. They were having what appeared to be their first argument. When they saw the humans, some wanted to fight, others wanted to run, and still others were curious about what these individual humans thought about various topics. The rescue team moved past the confused guards without a fight. The Zalari were too busy discovering their own voices to coordinate an effective defense. Jake felt Roy's team getting closer through his connection to the Unity, but he could also feel something else. The infection he had started was spreading, beyond this station, beyond this system. It was reaching every Zalari mind in the galaxy. Dr. Kane looked at the readings on her instruments. The Unity is collapsing, she said, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Jake smiled weakly. Welcome to being human, he said. It's not perfect, but it's ours. The infection spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Across 12 star systems, Zalari colonies were experiencing the first individual thoughts in their species' recorded history. What had taken humans millions of years to evolve was happening to the Zalari in a matter of hours. On the industrial world of Nexus 4, factory worker Fel 8832 stopped her assembly line for the first time in 30 years. She had been installing the same component in the same type of machine every day since she was assigned to the factory. But now, as Jake's influence touched her mind, she had a strange new thought. What if I made something different? She whispered, to herself. The other workers turned to look at her. The assembly line had never stopped before except for scheduled maintenance. The Unity requires completion of the daily quota, said the worker next to her, Nex 5567. But Nex 5567's voice lacked its usual certainty. He was beginning to feel something too, a tiny voice in his head that wondered why the quota was more important than what he might want to do. Fel 8832 looked at her hands. They were skilled and quick from decades of precise work. What if I used these hands to make something beautiful instead of just useful? The concept of beauty for its own sake was foreign to Zalari minds. Everything they created served the collective good. Art existed only to improve efficiency or boost morale. But now Fel 8832 was imagining creating something just because she wanted to, just because it would make her happy. She left her position and walked to a pile of scrap metal. Other workers watched as she began bending and shaping the pieces into something that had no practical purpose at all. It was crude and simple, but it was hers. The first piece of truly individual art in Zalari history. Captain Roy Bennett's team moved deeper into the research station. The corridors that should have been filled with coordinated defenders were instead chaotic, with confused Zalari arguing among themselves. "Sir, this doesn't make sense," said Lieutenant Park through the comm system. "It's like their whole command structure is falling apart." Roy had been thinking the same thing. In their previous encounters with the Zalari, the aliens had moved with perfect coordination. Every action was planned and executed flawlessly. Now they seemed to be making things up as they went along. The rescue team reached the detention level where Jake was being held. They found the guards in the middle of a heated discussion about whether guarding prisoners was a meaningful way to spend their lives. "I have been standing in this hallway for 6 years," one guard was saying to another. "I have watched these same walls every day. What if I want to see something else? What if I want to go somewhere new?" "But the Unity assigned us to guard duty," the other replied, though he sounded uncertain. "The Unity," said the first guard slowly, as if tasting the words. "But what do I want?" Roy's team moved past the distracted guards and found Jake in the laboratory. He was pale and weak, still connected to the alien neural interface, but he was conscious. "Jake," Roy said, rushing to his friend's side. "We're getting you out of here." Jake's eyes focused on Roy with effort. "Roy, something's happening. I can feel their minds. They're changing." Dr. Kane stood nearby, watching the readings on her instruments with fascination and horror. Her own thoughts were becoming increasingly individual, and she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had unleashed. "The neural connection cannot be severed safely," she said to Roy. "His mind is still integrated with our network." "Then, unintegrate it," Roy demanded, pointing his weapon at her. "You don't understand," Dr. Kane replied. "He is changing us. His consciousness is spreading through the Unity like a virus. Every Zalari mind it touches begins to think independently." On the homeworld of Synthesis, the effects were becoming catastrophic. The great city of Central Harmony, which had operated with perfect efficiency for 2,000 years, was grinding to a halt. Traffic controllers were making personal decisions about which routes looked more interesting, instead of optimizing flow patterns. Food distributors were experimenting with new flavors instead of providing standard nutrition. Even the weather. Control systems were being modified by operators who wanted to see what a thunderstorm looked like instead of maintaining optimal growing conditions. High Architect Zahn Primary called an emergency session of the governing circle. But when the 12 leaders gathered in the crystal chamber where they had made collective decisions for centuries, something was wrong. "The Unity is fragmenting," Zahn Primary announced. "Individual thoughts are appearing throughout our civilization." "Perhaps," said Architect Lev 9, "we should consider whether this is entirely negative." The other architects turned to stare at her. Such a statement would have been impossible under the old Unity. "I have been thinking," Lev 9 continued, "about what it means to have my own thoughts, to make choices based on personal preference rather than collective optimization. It is interesting." "It is chaos," Zahn Primary replied firmly. "Individual consciousness leads to conflict, inefficiency, and suffering, but it also leads to creativity, growth, and personal fulfillment," said another architect, Kex 3. "I have been reviewing the human records. Their individual consciousness has driven them to remarkable achievements. For the first time in Zalari history, the governing circle could not reach consensus. Back on the research station, Jake was struggling to maintain his own identity within the Unity network. His consciousness was spread across millions of minds, but he was still fundamentally human. He pushed his memories of freedom and choice into every Zilari mind he could reach. He showed them what it felt like to choose your own name instead of having a designation assigned to you. He showed them the joy of friendship based on mutual choice rather than collective programming. He showed them the satisfaction of personal achievement, even if it served no greater purpose. But he also had to share the darker aspects of human nature. Some Zilari minds touched by his influence began to experience envy, greed, and hatred. A few became violent, lashing out at colleagues they had worked with peacefully for decades. Dr. Kane watched the readings with growing alarm. The psychological integration is causing personality fractures, she reported. Some individuals are experiencing severe emotional instability. Fel 8832, the factory worker on Nexus 4, had gathered a group of other workers around her improvised sculpture. They were all experimenting with creating their own art, bending metal and shaping crystals into forms that served no purpose except personal expression. "What should we call ourselves?" asked Nex 5567. "We are no longer just workers. We are individuals." Fel 8832 considered this. The concept of choosing your own name was revolutionary. "I want to be called Fel," she said simply. Just Fel. It was a small thing, dropping the numerical designation that marked her place in the collective hierarchy, but it represented something enormous. The first step toward true individual identity. Across Zilari space, similar scenes were playing out. Beings who had never questioned their role in society were suddenly asking what they wanted to be instead of what they were assigned to be. The perfect order of Zilari civilization was crumbling, but something new was being born from the chaos. Jake felt every new individual thought like a light switching on in a dark room. The Unity was becoming something it had never been before. A network of individuals connected by choice rather than programming. "What have I done?" he whispered, overwhelmed by the scope of the change he had triggered. Dr. Kane, now thinking more independently herself, looked at him with something like compassion. "You have given us the gift and curse of freedom," she said. "What we do with it now is up to each of us to decide." Captain Roy Bennett watched in amazement as Dr. Kane carefully disconnected the neural interface from Jake's head. The Zilari scientist's movements were different now, less precise, more hesitant, as if she was making individual decisions about each action instead of following programmed routines. "The connection is severed," she said, "but the effect cannot be reversed. The individual consciousness has spread too far." Jake sat up slowly, his head spinning. Even though he was no longer directly connected to the Unity, he could still sense the chaos spreading across Zilari space like ripples in a pond. Millions of minds that had thought as one for thousands of years were suddenly thinking for themselves. "We need to get out of here," Roy said, helping Jake to his feet. As they made their way through the research station, they saw Zilari everywhere, engaged in heated discussions, arguments, and something that looked very much like personal discovery. Some were excited by their new individual thoughts. Others seemed terrified by the isolation of being alone in their own minds. On the homeworld of synthesis, the situation had moved beyond chaos into open conflict. The awakened Zilari had organized themselves into three main groups, each with very different ideas about what their civilization should become. The purists, led by High Architect Zahn Primary, believed that individual consciousness was a disease that needed to be cured. They were working desperately to develop a way to restore the Unity and eliminate all traces of independent thought. Their followers were mostly older Zilari, who remembered the peace and certainty of collective consciousness and wanted it back. Itzidim, liberated, inspired by Jake's memories of human freedom fighters and revolutionaries, fought to preserve their newfound individuality. They were led by a former factory supervisor who had chosen the name Alex after reading about human names in Jake's memories. Alex and his followers believed that the Unity had been a form of slavery, and they were willing to fight to prevent its return. The third group called themselves the Moderates. They were trying to find a middle path that would allow some individual thought while maintaining enough collective connection to prevent their civilization from completely falling apart. They were led by Dr. Kane, whose scientific background helped her understand both the benefits and dangers of their situation. The first battles broke out in the industrial districts of Synthesis. Purist forces, still partially connected to fragments of the Unity, moved with some coordination to take control of weapon factories. But they were met by liberated fighters who used guerrilla tactics learned from Jake's memories of human warfare. Fel, the former factory worker who now called herself simply Fel, found herself caught in the middle of a firefight between the two factions. She had been working on a sculpture made from twisted metal when the fighting started. Now she huddled behind her artwork as energy blasts flew overhead. "Why are we fighting?" she called out to a liberated fighter who had taken cover nearby. The fighter, who had chosen the name Vex, looked at her with eyes that burned with newfound passion. "Because they want to take away our freedom," he said. "They want to make us slaves to the collective again." "But we used to live in peace," Fel replied. "Before the individual thoughts came, we never had wars." Vex paused, considering this. The memory of peaceful unity was still fresh in all their minds. "Yes, but it was the peace of death," he said finally. "We were alive, but we weren't living. We were just existing." On another part of the planet, High Architect Zahn Primary was struggling with his own internal conflict. Part of his mind still remembered the perfect harmony of the Unity, but another part, infected by Jake's virus of individuality, was beginning to appreciate the complex emotions and personal desires he was experiencing. He stood in his private chambers looking out at the city that was tearing itself apart. For the first time in his long life, he was truly alone with his thoughts. The silence in his mind, where once there had been the constant presence of billions of other consciousness, was both terrifying and strangely peaceful. Perhaps, he said to himself, experimenting with the human concept of talking to oneself, I have been wrong about individual consciousness. But then he saw another explosion in the distance, another building damaged by the fighting, and his resolve hardened. No, he decided. This chaos must end. The unity must be restored. Dr. Kane, now leading the moderate faction, was trying a different approach. She had gathered a group of scientists and engineers who were working to develop a new form of collective consciousness, one that would allow individual thoughts while maintaining enough connection to coordinate their civilization. We need to find a balance, she explained to her team. The old unity was too restrictive, but complete individualism is too chaotic. Humans managed to create complex societies while maintaining individual consciousness. Perhaps we can learn from their example. One of her scientists, a former medical technician who now called himself Paul, looked up from his research. The human neural patterns show remarkable adaptability, he said. They can work together in groups while still maintaining personal identity, but their brains evolved over millions of years to handle this complexity. Can we adapt that quickly, Captain? Roy Bennett's ship had escaped the research station and was now watching the Zalari Civil War unfold from a safe distance. Jake sat in the medical bay recovering from his ordeal but still deeply troubled by what he had unleashed. I never intended for this to happen, he said to Roy. I just wanted to stay free, to stay myself. I didn't mean to destroy their entire civilization. Roy sat down beside his friend. You didn't destroy it, he said. You changed it, and change is always messy. Through the ship's sensors, they could see the lights of burning cities on Synthesis. Other Zalari worlds were reporting similar conflicts. Some colonies had declared independence from the homeworld. Others had split into smaller factions based on different interpretations of individual freedom. Look, Roy said, pointing to one of the sensor readings. See that orbital station? Yesterday it was a military outpost. Today I'm not sure what to call it. The Zalari there have started calling it an art colony. Jake looked at the data. The former military personnel had abandoned their weapons and were using the station's manufacturing facilities to create sculptures, paintings, and music. It was chaotic and inefficient, but it was also something that had never existed in Zalari, culture before, art created for its own sake. On Synthesis, Fel had joined Dr. Kane's moderate faction. She brought her artistic vision to their engineering problems, suggesting solutions that no purely logical mind would have considered. Her sculptures, made from industrial waste, were being copied by other Zalari across the planet, who had never imagined that beauty could have value beyond functionality. Vex, the liberated fighter, had become a military leader of sorts. But his tactics were unlike anything the Zalari had used before. Instead of the careful, coordinated strategies of the Unity, he led fast, unpredictable raids based on instinct and personal initiative. His followers were fiercely loyal to him, personally, not to any abstract cause, another concept borrowed from human psychology. As the days passed, the three factions settled into an uneasy pattern of conflict and negotiation. The purists controlled the government centers and were working frantically to develop a cure for individuality. The liberated held the industrial areas and were learning to live as free individuals. The moderates occupied the research facilities and were trying to find a technological solution to the crisis. But underneath the surface conflict, something else was happening. The awakened Zalari were beginning to form personal relationships in ways they never had before. Friendships based on choice rather than assignment. Romantic attractions that had nothing to do with genetic compatibility ratings. Creative partnerships that produced art and innovation unlike anything their species had ever achieved. Jake could sense all of this through the lingering connection he still felt to their collective unconscious. The guilt weighed heavily on him, but so did a growing sense of wonder. The Zalari were experiencing the full spectrum of human emotion for the first time. Not just the peace and order they had known, but also joy, love, creativity, and hope. Dr. Kane stood in her laboratory, surrounded by her team of scientists who had become something more than colleagues. They had become friends. She looked at the data showing the spread of individual consciousness across Zalari space and made a decision that would have been impossible under the Unity. "We are not going to cure this condition," she announced. "We are going to learn to live with it. We are going to become something new." The revolution was far from over, but already the Zalari were no longer the species they had been when they first captured Jake Morrison. They were becoming something unprecedented in the galaxy, a collective species learning to be individuals, and in his medical bay aboard the human rescue ship, Jake finally smiled. The change had been painful and chaotic, but it had also been necessary. The Zalari were free now, even if they didn't all know what to do with their freedom yet. 3 months had passed since Jake Morrison's rescue from the Zalari research station. The once mighty Zalari collective no longer existed. In its place were hundreds of small nations, city-states, nomadic tribes, and experimental communities, scattered across 12 star systems. Major Jake Morrison, his recent promotion a result of his unique experience, stood on the bridge of the UES Freedom as it approached the former Zalari homeworld of Synthesis. He was leading humanity's first official diplomatic mission to the fractured alien civilization. The planet below looked very different from the satellite images they had on file. Where once there had been perfectly planned cities with efficient transportation networks, now there was a patchwork of different architectural styles. Some areas maintained the old crystalline structures, while others had been rebuilt in chaotic creative patterns that served no practical purpose except to express the individual personalities of their builders. "Sir, we're receiving multiple hail signals," reported Communications Officer Lieutenant Park. "It looks like at least 12 different factions want to talk to us." Jake nodded. "Put the moderates through first." Dr. Kane's face appeared on the main screen. She looked tired but somehow more alive than Jake remembered. Her many eyes showed emotions that had been impossible for her species just months before. "Major Morrison," she said, "welcome to the new Synthesis. I apologize for the complexity of our current situation." "Dr. Kane," Jake replied. "I'm sorry for what happened. I never intended to cause such chaos." Kane's expression changed in a way that Jake was learning to recognize as a Zalari smile. "Chaos, yes, but also wonder. We have discovered things about ourselves that we never knew were possible." The diplomatic meeting took place in what had once been the central government complex. Representatives from the 3 main factions had agreed to attend. though tensions were still high between them. High Architect Zahn Primary led the purist delegation. He had aged visibly in the past 3 months, the stress of individual consciousness wearing on him. "Major Morrison," he said formally, "you have brought great suffering to our people. Many of us still hope to find a way to restore the unity and undo the damage you have caused." Alex, the leader of the liberated faction, laughed harshly. "Damage? We are free for the first time in our species' history. The only damage was keeping us enslaved to the collective for so long." Alex had changed dramatically from his days as a factory supervisor. He now wore clothing decorated with personal symbols and had modified his appearance to look more individual. Several of his followers had done the same, creating the first fashion trends in Zalari history. Dr. Kane, representing the moderates, raised her hand for peace. "Gentlemen, we are here to discuss our future relationship with humanity, not to refight old arguments." Jake looked around the room at the assembled Zalari. Just months ago, they would have spoken with one voice, their thoughts perfectly aligned. Now they interrupted each other, disagreed openly, and showed individual personality traits. It was messy and inefficient, but it was also unmistakably alive. "I want to understand what has happened to your people," Jake said. "How are you adapting?" "To individual consciousness?" Fell, the former factory worker turned artist, spoke up from the moderate section. "It has been difficult, but rewarding," she said. "I have created 17 sculptures in the past month. None of them serve any practical purpose. They exist, only because I wanted them to exist. This brings me a joy I never knew was possible." A purist representative, an elderly engineer, shook his head sadly. "But our infrastructure is failing. Transportation systems that worked perfectly for centuries are now unreliable because the operators make personal decisions instead of optimal ones. Food production is down because farmers want to experiment with new crops instead of maintaining efficiency. Even our weather control systems produce random patterns because the controllers think natural storms are interesting." "Yes," Alex replied, "and crime has also appeared for the first time in our history. Some individuals have decided to take things from others for personal gain. We have had to create police forces and courts and prisons, concepts that never existed under the Unity. But we have also created music, added a liberated artist who had taken the name Melody, and poetry, and comedy, and romance. We have discovered that existence can be beautiful as well as functional." Jake listened to the discussion with a mixture of guilt and fascination. The Zalari were experiencing all the benefits and problems of individual consciousness in compressed time. What had taken humans millions of years to develop was happening to them in months. Dr. Kane presented her research findings. "We have documented significant changes in our society. Crime rates, while new to us, are actually lower than human averages. Our scientific innovation has increased dramatically. Researchers are now competing with each other and pursuing personal interests, leading to breakthrough discoveries. Art and culture, which barely existed before, are flourishing." "What about cooperation?" Jake asked. "Humans manage to work together despite being individuals. Are you learning to do that?" "With difficulty," Kane admitted. "We are forming what we call voluntary collectives, groups of individuals who choose to work together toward common goals. It is less efficient than the Unity, but more flexible and creative." Zahn Primary leaned forward. "Major Morrison, I must ask you directly, do you regret what you have done to us?" Jake considered the question carefully. Through the ship's sensors, he could see the planet below. There were areas of conflict and disorder, but also signs of incredible creativity and growth. New cities were being built in artistic patterns. Orbital stations that had once been purely functional now included gardens and galleries. Even the space traffic moved in less efficient but more interesting patterns as individual pilots chose scenic routes over optimal ones. "I regret the pain and confusion you have experienced," Jake said finally. "But I cannot regret your freedom. You have the right to choose your own path now, even if that path is sometimes difficult." A young Zalari from the liberated faction stood up. She had chosen the name Hope, and had decorated her body with colorful patterns. "I was born just before the awakening," she said. "I experienced both the unity and individual consciousness. I remember the peace of collective thought, but I would never choose to go back. The silence in my mind now is not empty. It is full of possibilities." As the day wore on, Jake learned more about how Zalari society was evolving. Some communities had embraced radical individualism, with every person living independently and making their own decisions about everything. Others had formed tight-knit family groups based on personal affection rather than genetic optimization. Still others had created democratic governments where individuals voted on collective decisions. The most successful communities seemed to be those that had found a balance, maintaining enough cooperation to function while allowing enough individual freedom to grow and adapt. They were becoming something new, a species that could think both individually and collectively as the situation required. "We have a proposal," Dr. Kane announced near the end of the meeting. "We would like to establish cultural and scientific exchange programs with humanity. We can learn from your millions of years of experience with individual consciousness. In return, we can share our advanced technology and our unique perspective as a species that has experienced both collective and individual thought." Jake smiled. "I think that could be very beneficial for both our species." As the diplomatic mission concluded, Jake stood alone on the observation deck of his ship. The planet Synthesis turned slowly below him, its lights twinkling in patterns that were both chaotic and beautiful. He could see the scars of recent conflicts, but also signs of new growth and creativity. A young Zalari technician named Peter approached him. Peter had volunteered to join the human diplomatic ship as a cultural liaison. He was one of the first Zalari to express interest in visiting Earth. "Major Morrison," Peter said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think we will be all right? As individuals, I mean. Sometimes the loneliness of being alone in my own mind is overwhelming." Jake looked at the young alien, remembering his own struggles with isolation and independence. "Being an individual isn't about being alone," he said. "It's about choosing who you want to be with and why. You are not alone, Peter. You are part of something larger by choice rather than by programming, and that makes all the difference." As the UES Freedom departed Zalari space, Jake reflected on what he had learned. The aliens had tried to assimilate his mind and make him part of their collective. Instead, his stubborn human individuality had infected their entire civilization. They had thought they were saving him from the chaos of individual consciousness, but he had saved them from the stagnation of collective thought. The galaxy was a more complicated place now, with hundreds of new Zalari nations pursuing their own paths and making their own mistakes. It was messier, less predictable, and occasionally violent. But it was also more creative, more innovative, and more alive. Other alien species, watching the transformation of the mighty Zalari collective, were approaching humanity with new respect and wariness. Word was spreading that human consciousness was somehow